My name is Lorraine Whitaker. I am 65 years old, a retired community sports coach, and a woman who thought she had seen enough winters to be prepared for any kind of cold. But nothing could have prepared me for the Christmas night when I arrived unannounced at my daughter's home in Boise, Idaho. I had imagined warm lights, laughter, maybe even her smile when she saw me at the door. Instead, what I found froze my heart in a way no December wind ever could. On Christmas Eve, I came unannounced. My daughter stood on the driveway, teeth chattering, no coat. Inside, my in-laws were hosting a party, laughing by the fireplace. The sight cut me like a blade. Snow clung to Clara's hair, her lips trembled without sound, and her eyes, those eyes that once lit up with life, looked like they were fading under the weight of humiliation. Behind her, through the picture window, I could see golden light spilling out onto a scene that might have belonged in a holiday postcard. A long table stretched under a bright red cloth, laden with roasted turkey, cornbread, and wine. Glasses clinked in merriment. Victor, my son-in-law's father, raised his glass like a king presiding over his court. Helen, his wife, wore pearls and a smile colder than the icicles on the eaves. Their daughter Olivia sat near the fire, leaning in to whisper something that sent Marcus, my own son-in-law, into a fit of laughter. My daughter, my Clara, was not part of that world. She was outside in the snow, abandoned like a stray. Her shoulders shook violently, not just from the cold, but from the cruelty that had pushed her out here. I remember thinking in that instant, how could they feast while she froze? How could her husband, the man she trusted with her heart, leave her to suffer like this while he toasted with his family? I ran to her, my boots crunching against the ice. My coat fell from my shoulders as I wrapped it around her fragile body. She was light in my arms, too light, like the cold had hollowed her out. Her breath barely stirred against my neck when she whispered, "Mom." That single word, faint as a ghost, was enough to ignite a storm inside me. I would not let her endure another second of this disgrace. With Clara held tight, I walked straight to that door. My knuckles hovered only a moment before I pushed it open, my presence colliding with the warmth of their laughter. The fire snapped in the hearth, the smell of wine and roasted meat filled the air, but the silence that fell when they saw me was louder than any noise. Every eye in that room turned toward me, some in shock, others in annoyance, none in shame. I crossed the threshold, snow dripping onto their polished hardwood floor, holding my daughter against me as if she were a child again. And I said just one sentence they would never forget. Tonight, she comes with me. If you are listening to my story now, I hope you'll stay with me until the end. Share your thoughts, tell me where you're watching from, and join me in this journey. Because what happened that Christmas night was only the beginning, and the quiet war that followed changed everything. I left the airport that evening with the kind of nervous excitement that made me feel younger than my years. My suitcase rattled behind me, its wheels catching in the icy cracks of the pavement. The air was so sharp it stung my cheeks and forced me to pull the collar of my coat up around my face. I had been away for weeks, traveling with the team I once coached, living in hotel rooms, eating bland food, moving from practice halls to competition mats. My body was tired, but my heart was light because I knew I was finally going to see Clara. I imagined her surprised smile when she opened the door, how she would rush into my arms like she did as a child, and how for one Christmas evening, the years of distance and absence would melt away. Boise was dressed for the holiday. Storefronts glowed with strings of lights, wreaths hung heavy with ribbons, and families bustled along the sidewalks carrying parcels. Car horns blended with the faint sound of bells ringing from a church downtown. My taxi moved slowly through crowded streets, the windshield wipers squeaking against the frost. I leaned my head against the glass and let the rhythm carry me into memory. I remembered the Christmas mornings when Clara was small, when I would sneak into her room just as the first gray light touched the curtains. She would be curled under her blanket, her hair tangled, her little hand tucked under her cheek. The moment she opened her eyes and realized it was Christmas, her joy would burst like fireworks. She would grab my hand, pull me toward the living room where the tree stood glowing, and her laughter would fill the house. I carried those sounds inside me for years, replaying them in empty hotel rooms, telling myself that one day we would share them again. The taxi stopped at a red light, and through the haze of the frosted window, I saw a familiar figure. A group of officers were directing the heavy holiday traffic. Among them stood Tyler, tall and broad-shouldered, the boy I had once trained at the community center. He had grown into his uniform, his presence confident, but the same kind smile I remembered still lingered on his face. I rolled the window down, calling his name into the night air. He turned, and his eyes lit up with recognition. "Miss Whitaker," he called back, his voice cutting through the noise of cars and carolers. "You're back." I smiled, warmed by the sight of him. "Yes, just finished up in Seattle. I'm here to spend Christmas with Clara." For a moment, his expression froze, and something unreadable flickered across his face. His hand tightened on the brim of his cap, and he nodded too quickly. "That's wonderful," he said, but the brightness in his tone felt forced, like a curtain drawn over something heavier. My heart tightened. I leaned a little farther out the window. "Is everything all right? You saw her recently?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. A horn blared behind us, the light turned green, and the taxi jerked forward. "Drive safe, Miss Whitaker," he called after me, raising a hand in farewell. His eyes, though, held a weight that didn't match his words. I sat back in my seat, unsettled. What had he wanted to say? Why had he stopped himself? The driver hummed along to the Christmas music on the radio, unaware of the chill that had seeped into my bones. I tried to shake it off, telling myself Clara was probably busy preparing for the evening, that Tyler's hesitation was nothing. But the unease clung to me like the fog on the window. The road wound out of the busy downtown and into quieter neighborhoods, where houses stood like bright lanterns against the snow. I watched silhouettes of families gathering around tables, shadows moving across windows, the rise and fall of laughter carried faintly through the glass. Each scene was a reminder of what I longed for with Clara. I imagined her in her kitchen, maybe dusting flour across the counter, maybe humming a song we used to sing together while she cooked. She had always loved to make mashed potatoes with extra butter, just the way I taught her. I closed my eyes and pictured her waiting for me, the surprise and joy on her face when she realized I had come without warning. That vision was the rope I clung to as the car rolled deeper into the snow-draped streets. I told myself over and over that tonight would be different, that all the miles I had traveled, all the nights spent missing her, would finally be worth it. Yet beneath that hope, like a shadow trailing behind me, lingered the memory of Tyler's uncertain eyes. It was a look I could not shake, a look that whispered of something I was not yet ready to know. I asked the driver to stop a little way down the street so I could walk the last stretch alone. My boots sank into the snow with each step, the air so sharp it made every breath feel like glass sliding into my chest. I pulled my scarf tighter and lifted my gaze to the house where Clara lived, the place I had convinced myself was her sanctuary. Strings of golden lights curled around the eaves, glowing softly against the dark sky, and through the big bay window, I could see everything. The Whitlock home looked like a scene painted onto a Christmas card. A long table stretched across the room, covered with a bright red cloth and crowned with silver platters. A roasted turkey gleamed in the center, its skin golden and crisp, while bowls of cranberry salad, steaming mashed potatoes, and buttered rolls lined the edges. Crystal glasses caught the flicker of firelight, each filled with red wine that shimmered like rubies. The crackling fireplace cast an amber glow across the polished hardwood floors, wrapping the room in a cocoon of warmth. I stood in the cold and watched them raise their glasses, their faces lit with joy. Victor, the patriarch, sat at the head of the table, His back was straight, his suit impeccable even in his own home, and the air of judgment clung to him like a robe he had never taken off. He leaned back, lifting his glass with authority, his booming voice carrying through the window, though I could not catch the words. Around him, the family followed his lead like well-trained jurors. Helen sat close by, elegant as ever, her hair perfectly set, her pearls catching the light. She raised her glass with a smile that seemed carved more than lived. Her eyes sparkled with something colder than the snow pressing against my boots. She leaned toward her husband, whispering, her lips forming words meant to cut, though I could not hear them. Olivia, Marcus's younger sister, laughed lightly at something her father said, her chin tilted high, her gaze sharp as she scanned the room. Even from the driveway I could see her confidence, too polished, too sure of her place in the warmth of that home. And then Marcus himself, my son-in-law, walked past the window. He carried a wine bottle in one hand, his shirt collar unbuttoned just enough to suggest ease, but his posture carried the same arrogance I had noticed the first time we met. He leaned in to say something to Olivia, who burst into laughter, and then to his mother, who patted his arm with pride. He looked so sure of himself, so at home in his role, as though nothing in his life had ever gone wrong. I pressed my gloved hand to the cold glass, the sting of contrast making my chest ache. They were inside, wrapped in warmth, in laughter, in abundance. I was outside, my breath misting into the night. But it wasn't the exclusion that chilled me most. It was the sudden realization that I hadn't seen Clara. I searched the length of the table, the corners of the room, the spaces by the fire. I expected to find her, even if only for a glimpse, her hair catching the light, her hands folded in her lap, her quiet smile. But she wasn't there. I shifted, trying to peer deeper into the house. The table was full. Every chair seemed taken. Laughter rolled across the room like a tide, but none of it was hers. The longer I watched, the heavier the unease grew inside me. Clara was supposed to be in that room. She should have been laughing, even if faintly, even if with effort. She should have been carving the turkey, or passing the bread, or leaning against Marcus's shoulder, but the window offered me no sign of her. For a moment, I told myself she might be in the kitchen, perhaps setting out another dish, or checking on dessert. I wanted to believe she was simply busy, her back turned, her voice drowned in the clinking of glasses. But even as I tried to cling to that explanation, doubt threaded through me. I remembered Tyler's hesitation at the stoplight, the way his eyes clouded when I mentioned Clara. It felt now like an echo, like a warning I hadn't wanted to hear. Snowflakes settled on my lashes as I leaned closer to the window. Victor lifted his glass again, his words sparking a round of applause. Helen's laughter rang out, smooth and satisfied. Olivia clinked her glass against Marcus's, their smiles bright, their gestures careless in their comfort. The fire popped and flared, sending sparks up the chimney, while their voices carried with cheer. It was a portrait of belonging, of family, of everything Clara had once told me she wanted. Yet she was absent, invisible to them, and I felt a deep knot tighten in my chest. My heart began to pound with the rhythm of dread. The driveway stretched behind me, the cold biting deeper into my bones, but I stayed fixed to the window, searching every corner for her face. The warmth inside seemed louder with each second, and the silence of her absence screamed louder still. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut, in the marrow of my bones, in the memory of Tyler's almost confession. They were all there, basking in light and plenty, but Clara, my daughter, was nowhere to be found. I lingered by the window longer than I should have, the cold creeping up my legs and into my chest. The laughter inside the house grew sharper, its edges cutting through the glass like tiny blades. At first, I thought they were just toasting again, raising their glasses in holiday cheer. But then the words began to surface, slipping through the small crack where the door hadn't been pulled completely shut. Victor's voice was the first I recognized. Deep, commanding, laced with authority that had likely silenced courtrooms for decades. "A daughter-in-law who can't even give you children," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "What sort of legacy is that? 4 miscarriages? 4. Haven't we been humiliated enough?" His words hit me like a blow to the chest. The others laughed, a low, cruel chorus that carried into the night. I pressed my back against the wall, my gloved hand covering my mouth as if that could protect me from hearing more. Helen chimed in next, her voice smooth, almost musical, but poisoned at the core. "She lies in bed for hours, sulking, pretending she's sick. Depression, she calls it. What she really wants is attention." My breath caught in my throat. I had been on the other end of those calls, hearing Clara's voice break as she whispered that she couldn't stop crying, that she couldn't find her way out of the darkness. And now, here they were, reducing her suffering to theatrics, mocking her pain as if it were a game. Olivia's laugh was high and sharp, cutting through the hum of conversation. "Honestly, what use is she? A wife who can't give a child, who doesn't even join us for dinner. Useless. Pathetic." I dug my nails into my palms, rage boiling in my blood. Each word they spoke was like a knife twisting deeper, each insult echoing against every hope I had carried with me on the journey here. Marcus's voice came next, and it was the one that burned the most. "If it weren't for my parents, I'd have thrown her out already. Always crying, always weak. She can't handle real life. She's lucky we've tolerated her this long." I wanted to storm inside that instant, to throw the door open and scream in his face, to tell him he didn't deserve her love or her loyalty. But my feet felt frozen in place, my body trembling with fury and grief. My daughter, my Clara, had given her heart to this man, trusted him to build a family with her, and he had turned her pain into entertainment for his kin. Tears blurred my eyes as I leaned closer, the wood of the door rough against my cheek. The Whitlocks' voices overlapped now, sneers and chuckles blending with the clinking of glasses. They toasted again, not to love or hope, but to their own cruelty. I could hear the fire crackling behind their laughter, the pop of burning wood mingling with the sound of Clara's life being dismantled word by word. I could take no more. My body moved before my mind caught up, carrying me around the side of the house, searching for her. Something inside me screamed that she wasn't far, that if she wasn't welcome at their table, they had left her somewhere else. And then I saw her. She was slumped in an old wooden chair on the porch, tucked away in the shadows near a planter half buried in snow. My heart seized at the sight. She wore nothing but a thin blouse, her bare arms wrapped tight around herself, her shoulders shaking violently. Her hair clung damp to her forehead, strands frozen stiff against her pale skin. Her lips trembled as she tried to breathe, each exhale a small cloud of frost. I rushed to her side, my knees sinking into the snow as I reached for her. "Clara!" Her name broke from me like a prayer, like a cry I had been holding in for years. Her head lifted weakly, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, her lips parting just enough to form one fragile word. "Mom." I tore my coat from my shoulders and wrapped it around her shivering body, my hands trembling as I tucked it tight. Her skin was ice beneath my touch, her breath shallow, and the sight of her so frail tore me open. She leaned into me, her body collapsing against my chest, as though she had been holding herself upright only until I arrived. I pulled her close, rocking slightly, whispering against her hair though my voice quivered. "I've got you. I'm here now. You're safe." My tears slipped down my cheeks, warm against the biting wind. I looked toward the house, where their laughter still rang out, mocking, oblivious to the cruelty of leaving her out here alone. My fury burned hot, but it was tempered by the terror of how cold she was, how close I felt to losing her right there on that driveway. Clara's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, her head lolling against my shoulder. Panic surged in me, and I shook her gently, my voice firm though my throat ached. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Don't you leave me. Not tonight." She stirred faintly, her fingers clutching the fabric of my sleeve as if to anchor herself to me. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the Whitlocks toasted by the fire, warm and content, their glasses raised high. Outside, I held my daughter in my arms, her body trembling, her lips pale as the snowflakes melting on her skin. The contrast between their plenty and her suffering seared itself into my heart. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just a mother desperate to protect her child. I was a woman who had spent a lifetime teaching others to fight, to stand, to endure. And I knew now that I would not let Clara suffer another day at their hands. The Whitlocks thought they had broken her, cast her aside like she was nothing. But they had not reckoned with me. I pressed my cheek to hers, her cold skin shocking against my warmth, and whispered into the night, steady and fierce, "You're coming with me, Clara, whatever it takes." I kicked the door with my shoulder, and it swung wide, a gust of snow chasing us into the heat. The room froze mid-laugh. Chairs scraped faintly as people stared, then went perfectly still. Firelight rippled over wood, over pearls and suits, over a table heavy with food. I held Clara close, light, her breath thin against my collarbone. Helen recovered first. She set her glass down with a click and arranged her smile like a hostess correcting a fork. "Lorraine," she said, voice warm enough to fog a mirror, eyes colder than the window. "If you had called, we would have sent someone. Clara wanted a bit of fresh air. You know how she is. She gets dramatic when the room is lively." I stepped farther in, the door thudding against the wall. "Fresh air?" I pulled my coat tighter around my daughter. Her fingers had no color. Her nails were bluish from the cold already. "She's shaking." I looked from face to face, and not one flinched. Olivia leaned back in her chair, an elbow hooked over the backrest. "We told her to come in," she said lightly. "She needed a moment to herself. Some people don't thrive in crowds." Clara stirred, a small sound curling out of her. I settled her on the end of the sofa near the fire and tucked my scarf around her shoulders. The heat licked at her cheeks. I could hear her teeth knocking together. Marcus appeared at my shoulder. He had a bottle of wine in one hand and that same careless tilt to his chin. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at me like I had stepped onto his stage uninvited. "Don't make a scene," he said, voice low, crisp. "We're in the middle of dinner. You're dripping on the rug." Something inside me steadied. "My daughter was on the porch in a blouse while you raised your glasses." He gave a small shrug, a smile that never reached his eyes. "She wanted air. She said she was fine. You know how she gets." I straightened, the fire at my back. Victor rose with slow ceremonial calm, napkin folded over his palm like a judge putting on his robe. "This is a family matter," he said, and the room stilled. "A household can only run when its members learn their roles. A wife must learn to bear up under strain. That is the nature of commitment." A breath moved through me, cold and hot at once. Commitment is not freezing a woman outside her own door. He lifted his chin. Discipline is not cruelty, and endurance is not punishment. If she cannot manage her moods, she cannot expect the house to stop for her. Helen clasped her hands as if praying over the turkey. "Lorraine, truly, you are overreacting. Clara steps out, swoons, sulks. She always has. We coddle her, and it only gets worse. Tonight just got away from her." Olivia's laugh was soft and surgical. "She refused to help set the table, then claimed she was tired. We all make allowances, but there are limits." I watched Marcus finally look at his wife. The glance was brief and empty. He refilled Victor's glass with careful precision. "Please wrap this up," he said to me, not to her. We respect your concern, but we'd like to finish dinner without theatrics. Clara blinked at the fire, lost in the tremor running through her. I knelt so my face was level with hers, set my palm over her cold knuckles, and spoke so she could hear me above the hush. You're safe. When I looked up, I let the room see what would not yield. Safe. Do you understand? Victor sighed, a judge tired of amateurs. I'll have a blanket brought, he said to no one, to everyone. Then perhaps Clara can rest and we can continue. No. The word left me before I could shape it softer. This ends tonight. Helen tilted her head, sympathetic and sharp. Where would she go, dear? You have your little apartment by the training center. She needs a home. Home is not a room where a woman is an afterthought. I stood. Home begins with dignity. Marcus's voice hardened. You're overstepping. This is my house. I stepped between him and Clara. Then your house has forgotten what a door is for. I reached for the throw on the arm of the sofa and wrapped it around Clara, then lifted her carefully. She was heavier than she had been a moment before, or I was tired of how light she had become. Victor's tone cooled. Put her down. I met his stare. No. Olivia shifted, a hairline crack in her poise. This is unnecessary. Unnecessary, I repeated, is leaving a woman to freeze while you argue semantics. I took a step toward the door. Marcus moved to block me, shoulders squaring, jaw set. Don't, I said quietly. You don't want to remember yourself this way. His nostrils flared. For a heartbeat, I thought he would reach for Clara. He didn't. He looked past me to Victor, waiting for the old man to decide what kind of men they would be in this moment. Victor smoothed his napkin and laid it beside his plate. You may take a walk, he said, contempt wrapped in courtesy. Return when she has calmed down. There will be no further disruption. I turned toward the door with Clara in my arms and snow ghosting along the threshold. My voice was steady, low enough to carry only to the people who most needed to hear it. Tonight, she comes with me. Then I stepped forward, and the night took us in. Clara was light in my arms, lighter than she should have been. Snow slipped under my collar and stung the skin at my wrists where the coat didn't quite meet the gloves. A tremor moved through her, like a small bird trying not to be noticed. I set my cheek against her hair and counted breaths, the way I used to count repetitions on a gym floor, steady and slow. Behind us, our footprints cut two pale ruts toward the street. The window glowed with honeyed light, but it had nothing to say I could trust. The night was iron cold, and I welcomed it because it told the truth. 4 phone calls had remade me long before this night. The first came one spring afternoon when the gym smelled of rubber and effort. I was timing footwork drills when my phone buzzed. Clara's voice was thin and frayed. Mom, it happened. I turned to the wall so the kids wouldn't see and pressed my palm to the cinder block as if the solid weight could keep the world from tipping. She said the doctor couldn't find a heartbeat. I said her name until the syllables steadied into breath. I told her I would come. She told me to finish practice, that she would be all right. The whistle blew, and I hated it for sounding normal. I finished anyway, and the floor felt like thin ice under my feet. There. The second call reached me in a motel off the highway, where the heater rattled like an old bone. She said she had lifted a pair of infant socks at the pharmacy and set them back because Hope felt arrogant. She tried to laugh, and the sound broke like thin glass. I told her to make tea, to eat toast, to let Marcus drive her home. After I hung up, I watched truck lights smear red along the interstate. I promised I would visit that weekend and pretended promises were shelter. The third call came on a Sunday when bells rang somewhere I couldn't see. She didn't cry. She read her body aloud, as if following directions to a place neither of us wanted to reach. Spotting, cramps, a heaviness that tugged her sentences apart. I sat in my car behind the gym and listened to the space between her words. The silence pressed on my chest. I said I would fly that day. She asked me not to. She said she hated feeling like a detour in my calendar. I told her she was the road. When we hung up, I rested my forehead on the steering wheel and counted to 60. The last call was only my name, not Mom, but Lorraine, as if she were standing on a shoreline I couldn't reach. I was in Seattle, clipboard in hand, telling young athletes that grit is a muscle. I told her I would come after the weekend. I told myself commitment mattered. I forgot that the first promise I ever made was to the girl whose shoelaces I tied and whose nightmares I sat beside until morning. A car passed now, tires whispering over packed snow. The driver slowed, then moved on when I shook my head. I shifted Clara higher. The coat slumped around her like a tent near collapse. In the lamplight, her lashes were tipped with melt. Her mouth trembled. When she spoke, the sound was barely there. "I'm tired, Mom. Not tired from cold, not tired from a long day, tired like winter is tired of holding itself together." The sentence slid into me and unlocked a door I had kept barred with competence and good manners. "I hear you," I said into her hair. My breath fogged and thinned. For years, I had taught other people's children to hold their ground, to breathe through the burn, to finish strong. I sent money, sent notes, sent my best advice wrapped in schedules. But gifts that arrive late can feel like judgment. Reliability can become an alibi. A woman can be steadfast to everyone except the person who needs her most. That truth didn't crush me. It steadied me. I turned toward the street that would take us away from the glowing window. Hedges hunched under white caps. The mailbox stood like a small monument to ordinary life. Somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet. Clara's fingers twitched against my sleeve. I tightened my hold and spoke to keep her anchored. "Stay with me," I said, and I didn't know if I meant this hour or the years ahead, only that I wanted both and was done asking permission for either. At the corner, I let the cold stipple my face until I felt fully awake. I looked back once at the house that had taught my daughter to apologize for existing. I didn't make threats. I didn't rehearse declarations. I set down what had kept me polite: deference to other people's comfort, the superstition that quiet equals peace, the habit of shrinking so others could spread out. The wind shifted, and the snow looked alive under the streetlight, lifting and settling like a slow breath. Silence had protected the wrong people. I would not carry it another step. I would not confuse endurance with love or harmony with safety. The path from that doorstep to the rest of our lives began here, in the iron-cold night, with my arms under my child, and the word tired ringing like a bell calling me home. I shifted her once more and began to walk, not carefully now, but surely, as someone walks when the waiting is over, and the answer is yes to everything that matters. The apartment felt too small when I carried Clara inside, though it had always been enough for me. The narrow hallway, the scuffed floorboards, the worn sofa. It was plain, but mine, a place where I had spent quiet evenings after training sessions, drinking tea and letting my muscles cool from the day's work. Tonight it felt both like a shelter and a fragile shell, the only barrier between us and the family who had left my daughter to freeze. I laid her on the couch, wrapped her in my thickest blanket, and stirred a pot of water for tea. She didn't speak, only kept her eyes half closed, her lips pressed together as if words would cost too much. I sat nearby, listening to the radiator groan, to the faint whistle of wind against the window. I should have felt safe, but my stomach knotted. Every instinct sharpened. Years of training had taught me to sense danger before it showed itself, and that same warning thrummed through me now. When the kettle hissed, I poured her a cup and set it in her hands, curling her fingers around the ceramic. She gave me a faint nod, a trace of gratitude, but her shoulders remained heavy, her spirit dulled by exhaustion. I stayed awake long after midnight, Clara drifted in and out of sleep, her breath shallow under the quilt. I gathered papers from an old box, bank transfers I had sent, letters, messages, scraps of proof that I had supported her even when Marcus squandered the money. I spread them across the kitchen table, each one a fragment of the story they had tried to erase. It was then that I heard it, the soft scrape at the door, a sound that didn't belong. I froze, every muscle alert. Another faint shift followed, like paper brushing wood. I stood silently, my heart pounding, and moved to the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, the cold seeping in through the crack. On the floor lay an envelope, plain and unmarked. I bent to pick it up, and even before I slid it open, I knew what I would find. The words were scrawled in hurried ink. "Don't fight us. Don't drag the Whitlock name into mud. Stay quiet if you want to live in peace." I let the paper crumple in my fist. For a long moment I stood there staring into the hallway, the air biting at my ankles, the silence pressing against me. Someone had been close enough to touch the door. Someone had stood where I stood now, certain I would find their warning. I closed the door slowly, locking it twice, my breath steady but hot with rage. Clara stirred when I returned to the living room. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Nothing you need to see tonight," I said softly, tucking the blanket higher around her shoulders. But inside, I knew this was the beginning. The Whitlocks wanted me silent. They had mistaken me for a woman who bowed to fear. The next morning, I stepped out to clear my thoughts. The snow had hardened into a crust that crunched beneath my boots. Across the street, leaning against a lamppost, stood Tyler. His uniform hat shadowed his eyes, but when he saw me, he straightened and gave a small nod. He crossed the street slowly, his hands deep in his coat pockets, the steam of his breath curling like smoke. "Miss Whitaker," he said, voice low, "I couldn't sleep knowing what I saw last night. I've been keeping an eye out." "You heard them," I said quietly. "You saw her." He nodded once. "I did, and I can swear to it if it comes to that." I hesitated, then pulled the crumpled note from my pocket and handed it to him. He read it without surprise, his jaw tightening. "They won't stop," he muttered, "not unless someone pushes back." I looked at him, at the boy I had once corrected in the dojo for sloppy footwork, now a man who carried a badge and the weight of choices. I can't let Clara go back to that house. I can't let them write the story of her life in their words. "You don't have to," he said. He folded the paper neatly, slid it into his pocket. "I'll keep watch, quietly, and if you start gathering what you need, I'll be there to back you up." His calm steadied me. For the first time since stepping off the plane, I felt less alone. "This isn't just their cruelty anymore," I said, more to myself than to him. "It's a fight for truth." Tyler's eyes were steady. "Then let's make sure truth has a chance." I went back inside, my resolve ironed flat and sharp. Clara slept deeply now, the blanket rising and falling with her breath. I looked down at her and thought of the 4 phone calls that had chipped away at her spirit, of the cold porch that nearly took her last night, and of the words she had whispered. "I'm tired, Mom." I promised her then, silently, that I would not let this end in silence. The Whitlocks thought fear would quiet me, but fear, once named, becomes fuel, and I was ready to burn every ounce of it into light. I cleared the kitchen table and set a shoebox on it. The lid was soft with age, corners frayed from years of opening and closing. Inside were envelopes, bank receipts, printouts of emails, and handwritten notes I kept because love, even when busy, keeps records. The radiator ticked behind me. Outside, sirens faded, and the building breathed its winter fatigue, softly now. I laid the papers in rows, date by date, so the story could stand up straight. Clara slept late on the couch, the blanket lifting and falling. When she stirred, I brought her tea and the gray sweater she used to keep in my closet. She sat slowly, the cup held in both hands, and looked at the table. "Mom," she said, voice rough, "what are you doing?" "Remembering," I said, "and asking paper to remember with me." She stood a moment and then took the chair across from me. I passed her a stack of transfer slips, each with a note in the memo line: new tires, pantry restock, doctor copay, just because. She read in silence, eyes moving from dates to me. "I don't want to make this uglier," she whispered. "It already is," I said. "We're only refusing to pretend." We worked without hurry. I sorted by month. She opened envelopes and flattened creases. Every few minutes she paused and turned her head, listening for sounds that weren't there. Steps in a hall, a key at a door. I kept my voice even, the tone I used to teach breath after a hard run. "In through the nose," I murmured. "Out through the mouth." From a folder, I pulled printed messages I had saved because the phone felt too fragile to trust. Her words came back in thin gray fonts. "I'm not sleeping. It hurts to eat. He says it's all in my head." My replies were there too: recipes for soup, the number of a counselor, plain sentences ending in love. Seeing them on the wood felt like finding breadcrumbs I had dropped in the dark. "Marcus will say you're meddling," she said. "Marcus has had a long life of being believed," I said. "It won't hurt him to meet proof." She smoothed a grocery receipt. "He always said we were fine. That help made him look small." She swallowed. "He said gratitude should be quiet." "Gratitude is honest," I said. "Silence is something else." Outside, wind pushed fine snow against the window. The apartment smelled of paper and tea. I added a stack of medical bills she had mailed me by mistake. I paid them before she could ask. Each line threaded a needle through a memory: ultrasound, lab work, follow-up. I wrote dates in a neat hand and let the ink dry. "Do we have to do this now?" she asked. "Yes," I said, softer. "We don't have to finish today, but we have to start." Her gaze drifted to the bookshelf by the door. She rose and pulled out a thin spiral notebook, the one I had given her the year she married, blue cover with a gold line. She held it without opening. When she lifted the cover, I heard the sound before I saw what was missing. Several pages had been torn away. The remaining sheets were cramped with lists, appointment times, what to cook for company, phrases to keep peace, small goals written like prayers. A scrap of tape clung to a ripped edge. She looked up at me, ashamed. "He didn't like me writing down feelings," she said. "He said it made problems look bigger." I breathed slowly, because anger would send her back into the cold. "This isn't for him," I said. "This is for us." And we photographed every page that remained and slid the notebook into a clear sleeve. Clara's hand shook as she sealed it. "What if they win anyway?" she asked. "What if none of this matters?" I set my palm over hers. "Winning is for people keeping score," I said. "We are keeping record." She nodded, but worry clung to her face. I told her a patrol car had lingered near the block through the night, and that the officer I trusted would be close if we needed him. I did not turn reassurance into a plan. I let it be a warm stone she could carry. Time shifted the way it does when a task is simple and careful. We labeled envelopes. We dated photographs. We kept a log. Snow on the sill at dawn. The note at the door. Clara's temperature at noon. I wrote like a stenographer of the ordinary, because truth often comes to court in its plain clothes. When we paused, the only sounds were the tap of the radiator and the soft slide of paper. By dusk, the stacks looked less like clutter and more like a spine. Clara rested her head on her arms, not to cry, but to be someone who could rest without asking permission. I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and studied the map we had made. It was not a weapon. It was a lantern. "Tomorrow," I said, "we'll make copies. We'll put them in places that won't burn." She didn't lift her head, but I heard the sound a person makes when the air inside finally matches the air outside. I stepped to the window and watched the street go blue with evening. A car idled half a block away. Fear could take a chair by the door if it wished. It could listen to us sort and date and sign. It would not be offered the last word. We had begun, and beginning was the longest step of all. The courthouse smelled of polish and old paper, the kind of air that felt heavy with decisions already made. I held Clara's hand as we entered, her fingers trembling in mine, and guided her past the rows of benches. Mr. Bennett, tall and steady with a leather briefcase worn from years of battles, gave me a reassuring nod. "We've prepared all we can," he murmured. I squeezed Clara's hand tighter. She looked pale under the fluorescent lights, her lips pressed thin, but her eyes held a quiet spark. She knew, as I did, that this was not just about her marriage. It was about truth itself. Across the aisle sat Marcus, sharp in a tailored gray suit, his hair slicked back with too much care. Helen and Victor flanked him, Olivia lounging beside them as if she had come to a play, waiting for the drama to entertain her. Victor whispered something to Marcus, and Marcus gave a short nod, lips curved in the faintest smile. It was the expression of a man who believed the judge was already in his pocket. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered. He was middle-aged, expression blank, but his gaze flicked toward Victor with a hint of recognition. My stomach tightened. Influence lingered like perfume, invisible but unmistakable. We all stood, then sat when told. The gavel sounded like the closing of a cage. Marcus's lawyer rose first, a young man with a polished tone and too much confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "we will show today that Mrs. Clara Whitaker Lawson has exaggerated her condition, neglected her duties as a wife, and burdened the Whitlock family unnecessarily. We will prove she has been indolent, self-indulgent, and unfit to manage the responsibilities entrusted to her." His words cut, rehearsed, and cruel. He called their first witness, a woman who had once cleaned for the Whitlocks. She shifted on the stand, eyes darting, then claimed Clara spent her days locked in her room, ignoring household work, leaving everything to others. "She barely cooked," the woman insisted. "Never cleaned. Sometimes she wouldn't even speak for days. I had to do it all." Clara's shoulders folded inward. I gripped her hand, whispering, "Stay steady, mister." Bennett rose calmly, his glasses low on his nose. "Mrs. Green," he said gently, "you were employed by the Whitlocks, correct? And who paid your wages?" She hesitated. "Mr. Whitlock." "And if Mr. Whitlock suggested what to say here today, would you refuse him?" The witness shifted, eyes flicking to Marcus, who sat with a small smirk. I don't know what you mean." Bennett's voice sharpened. "Do you recall December 24th of last year?" Her face paled. "I wasn't working that night." "Exactly," Bennett said. "So you cannot speak to Mrs. Lawson's behavior then, can you?" She faltered, mumbled something, then sat back down, her testimony crumbling. A murmur spread through the gallery. Marcus clenched his jaw, but Victor's calm never wavered. Next came Victor himself. He walked to the stand with the measured pace of a man used to commanding attention. "I spent my career on the bench," he began, his voice deep, resonant. "I know the difference between hardship and weakness. My daughter-in-law suffers not from cruelty, but from lack of resilience. Families must teach endurance. That is what we tried to do." The judge leaned forward slightly, listening with unusual attentiveness. I felt bile rise in my throat. Victor spoke not just as a father-in-law, but as a man still cloaked in the authority of his old robes. He painted Clara's suffering as exaggeration, her miscarriages as excuses, her depression as laziness. Each word was delivered like a gavel strike. Clara sat motionless, eyes fixed on the table, but her hand gripped mine as if holding on through a storm. When Bennett rose to cross-examine, Victor's gaze was cool, almost amused. "Mr. Whitlock," Bennett said, "is it true that on Christmas Eve your family held a dinner while Clara was outside in below-freezing weather?" Victor's lips curved faintly. "She chose to step outside. We cannot force an adult to join us. Did you or anyone else attempt to bring her back in?" "She wanted air," Victor repeated smoothly. "We respected her wishes." The judge nodded slightly, as though persuaded. My chest burned. Then Bennett gestured to the back of the room. "Your Honor, I would like to present official documentation filed by Officer Tyler Hayes, who was on duty that evening. He witnessed Clara Whitaker Lawson left outside the Whitlock residence without proper clothing. His written report details her condition as shivering, near hypothermic, visibly distressed. May I submit this into evidence?" A ripple moved through the courtroom. Marcus shifted, his composure cracking for the first time. Helen's face tightened. Olivia's smirk vanished. Victor's hands clasped together, the only sign of tension. The judge took the papers, scanning them. "This is unusual," he said cautiously. "Officer Hayes, you are present?" Tyler rose from the gallery, uniform crisp, eyes steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I witnessed the incident directly. I can testify under oath." The judge gestured for him to approach. Tyler spoke with clear conviction, describing how he had passed the Whitlock home, how he had seen Clara trembling in the cold, how he had noted her condition and the laughter spilling from inside. "No one attempted to help her," he said firmly. "Her mother arrived and carried her inside. That is the truth." The silence in the courtroom was electric. Marcus's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is irrelevant." "Overruled," the judge said sharply, his voice tighter now, perhaps knowing that too blatant a dismissal would expose him. He looked again at the report, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. I turned to Clara. Her eyes were wet, her lips trembling, but for the first time I saw her shoulders lift, as if the weight pressing her down had shifted slightly. Victor leaned forward in his seat, his jaw tight, and whispered something harsh to Marcus. The air between them was no longer smug, but taut with unease. Bennett closed his briefcase calmly. "The Whitlocks can spin words, but facts speak louder. And the fact is simple. Clara was left outside on Christmas night, abandoned by those who claim to be her family. That is not discipline. That is cruelty." The gavel struck once more, echoing through the room. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, the Whitlocks had lost their absolute hold on the story. The courtroom had fallen into a tense silence after Tyler's testimony, a silence so sharp I could hear Clara's shallow breaths beside me. Her hands trembled in her lap as though her body already anticipated what was coming. The judge leaned back, his eyes flicking toward Victor, then back to the papers on his bench. For a moment, hope fluttered inside me. I thought maybe, just maybe, the truth had pierced the armor that family carried like a crown. Then the gavel came down, 3 deliberate strikes that sounded like nails into wood. "After careful consideration," the judge began, his tone flat, "this court grants dissolution of marriage between Marcus Whitlock and Clara Lawson Whitlock. However, the evidence presented is insufficient to establish a sustained pattern of abuse under the law. Accordingly, division of assets shall be determined based on financial contribution and standing." I felt the words land like stones. My chest tightened. The room blurred at the edges. Clara's head dropped as if the floor had pulled her down. Marcus exhaled a slow, satisfied breath, and Helen smoothed the pearls at her throat. Victor didn't move at all, but the shadow of triumph curved his mouth. Bennett rose immediately. "Your Honor, The sworn testimony of an officer, corroborated with written reports and medical records, speaks directly to neglect and endangerment. To disregard such evidence is—" The judge lifted his hand. "Mr. Bennett, this court has heard enough. Officer Hayes' statement confirms a singular incident. Cruel, perhaps, but not legally abusive. The law requires sustained proof." I pushed myself to my feet before Bennett could reply. My voice cut through the chamber. "So, leaving a woman half frozen while her family laughed at a feast is not abuse? It's not enough?" The judge's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Whitaker, you will sit down." But the words burst out of me louder now. "I carried my daughter into that house. I heard them mock her pain, her miscarriages, her body. How many scars do you require? How many graves?" "Mom," Clara whispered desperately, tugging at my sleeve. Her eyes were wide, begging. "Please, don't. Not like this. I can't." I looked down at her, the way her shoulders hunched, as though she already expected more blows, this time from the very system that should have sheltered her. I sank back to my chair, my pulse raging in my ears. The judge cleared his throat and read the ruling as if reciting weather. Clara would keep her personal belongings and a small stipend. Marcus, backed by his family's resources, would retain most assets and property. It was a ledger, not a judgment, and it left dignity off the page. When the gavel struck to close the session, Marcus rose slowly, adjusting his cufflinks. He turned, and for the first time in the entire trial, he looked straight at me. His smile was cold, practiced. "You fought hard," he murmured, his voice just loud enough for me to hear. "But in the end, you're just a useless old woman clinging to scraps. That's all you'll ever be." The words hit harder than the ruling itself, not because they were true, but because they revealed how deeply he believed them. His contempt was the Whitlock creed, sharpened and handed down. Clara gasped, but I felt my own fury before her fear. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. Tyler stepped forward instinctively, placing himself just enough between us to remind Marcus that his badge was more than decoration. Marcus smirked and brushed past, his cologne sharp, his arrogance sharper. Helen and Olivia followed, whispering to each other, their laughter hushed but unmistakable. Victor lingered a moment longer, his eyes fixed on me. There was no gloating in his expression, only certainty. The certainty of a man who thought he still controlled the board. Then he turned and walked out, cane tapping softly on the marble floor. Clara leaned against me, her body limp with exhaustion. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice held no relief. "Please let it be over, Mom. I can't take more fighting." I smoothed her hair back from her face, forcing my own fury into stillness. "It's not over," I said inside myself, though I didn't speak the words to her. Out loud, I whispered, "I've got you." Bennett gathered our files with slow, deliberate movements. His jaw was tight, his eyes storm dark. "We'll appeal," he said quietly. "We'll find a higher court less tangled in favors. But it will take time." Tyler stepped closer, his hand brushing the pocket where the report had been. His silence was an oath. He knew, as I did, that truth wasn't finished. Clara clung to my arm, her plea still in my ear. She wanted rest, not war. She wanted a life where her body wasn't a battlefield and her heart wasn't collateral. I wanted that for her more than anything. But rage has a memory, and so does justice. And even as I held her and soothed her with promises of quiet, I knew I would not let Marcus's words be the final sentence carved into this story. The courthouse doors opened, letting in a gust of winter. We stepped into the cold together, the world dim with snow and exhaust fumes. People bustled past, coats drawn tight, heads bent. Life went on as though nothing had happened. But in my chest, something had cracked open wider than grief. Marcus thought I was a useless old woman. He would learn that useless women do not carry daughters out of fire, do not collect every paper, every whisper of truth, and turn them into weapons sharper than knives. He would learn that silence is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. He had won today, but today was only one chapter. The snow was still falling when we stepped out of the courthouse. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, and microphones rose like a thicket of steel stems. Clara clung to my arm, pale and unsteady, her scarf pulled high over her mouth. Tyler walked on our other side, his shoulders squared, eyes locked on Marcus as he emerged behind us. Marcus carried himself like a victor returning from battle, straightening his tie, smirking at the press, his parents flanking him like royalty. Then it happened, quick as a spark. Marcus muttered something under his breath, not meant for the crowd, but close enough for Clara to hear. "Pathetic," he sneered. "Yeah. You'll always be nothing." His words were sharp, aimed like knives. I felt Clara flinch. Tyler's body tensed beside me, and in a heartbeat he turned, his fist clenched, his whole frame drawn like a bow ready to strike. The air seemed to freeze with him. Cameras clicked, gasps rang out. Clara stumbled forward, planting herself between Tyler and Marcus. Her voice cracked, but carried clear. "Don't. He isn't worth it." Her small hands pressed against Tyler's chest, stopping the blow that would have landed. For a second, all sound fell away. Then the world erupted. Shutters exploded like fireworks. Reporters shouted over one another, capturing every detail. The weary daughter shielding the man who had broken her. The policeman's rage held back only by her trembling plea. I stood frozen, my heart battering my ribs. Clara's face was turned toward the cameras, streaked with tears, her words echoing, "He isn't worth it." Within hours, the footage spread like fire. Clips appeared on every news site, headlines blazing. "Estranged wife protects husband from violence outside courthouse." The angle varied, but the image was always the same. Clara, small and shaking, her hands up like a shield, Marcus's smirk visible behind her shoulder. By evening, millions had watched. By morning, millions more had taken sides. What the court refused to recognize, the people did. Comment sections filled with outrage. She was freezing outside while they feasted. How could the judge ignore an officer's sworn statement? The Whitlocks disgust me. Hashtags bloomed. Justice for Clara, hashtag Whitlock cruelty, hashtag she comes with me. Even strangers who had never met her wrote as if they knew her story by heart. They pieced together every scrap, the officer's testimony, the note slipped under my door, the image of Clara outside in the snow. And at the center was the video of her shielding Tyler from doing what the whole crowd longed to do, strike back. The Whitlocks scrambled. Their lawyer issued statements about misunderstandings and respecting the court's decision. Helen tried to sound maternal on television, insisting Clara was fragile and had been confused. Olivia posted smiling photos as if to drown the noise, but the tide had turned. Sponsors began cutting ties with Victor's charitable foundation. Marcus's firm suspended him pending review. Invitations that once filled their calendars evaporated overnight. The public did what the judge would not. It branded their name with shame. I watched from our small apartment, the glow of Clara's phone screen lighting her face as she scrolled. At first, she looked bewildered. "Why do they care, Mom? They don't even know me." "Because they see you," I told her. "They see what I saw, a woman standing in the cold, while the ones who vowed to love her laughed inside. And they know it could have been their daughter, their sister, their friend." She bit her lip, tears spilling silently, not from fear this time, but from recognition. For once, the world wasn't calling her weak, it was calling her brave. Tyler stopped by that evening, still shaken from the moment. He apologized, his voice heavy. "I nearly lost it, Mrs. Whitaker. If she hadn't stepped in, you didn't, I reminded him. She stopped you, and that's what everyone saw. They saw her courage, and now, so does he. On the screen, Marcus's face appeared in looped clips, his sneer, his careless words, his reputation unraveled with every replay. The man who had thought himself untouchable was suddenly the symbol of arrogance brought low. Victor, too, could not hide. His long shadow over the courts was dragged into the light as old whispers resurfaced. Cases dismissed, decisions questioned. For the first time in years, I felt the stir of something larger than law. Justice that didn't wear robes or carry gavels. Justice carried in the voices of ordinary people who would not let cruelty be forgotten. Clara lay beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder, phone still glowing in her hand. Comment after comment scrolled past. "You're not alone. We believe you. Stay strong." I kissed her hair and whispered, "See? The world is wider than the Whitlock's walls." She closed her eyes, the tension in her face easing for the first time in months. The room was quiet except for the hum of the radiator, but outside, the world roared for her. And I knew then that the tide had turned. The Whitlocks might still hold keys to courts and coffers, but their name had already been stripped bare. Their empire had cracked in the one place they could never control, the hearts of those watching. Dr. Morgan's office smelled faintly of lavender and clean paper, the kind of scent chosen to suggest calm without being intrusive. The room was small, lined with books, and a soft lamp glowed in the corner. Clara sat on the couch, her shoulders drawn up, hands folded in her lap. I stayed in the chair beside her, angled so she knew I was there, but without crowding her. It was her space, not mine, and I was learning that healing begins by giving room. Dr. Morgan spoke in a low, even voice. "Clara, I'd like to start with something simple, not the hardest moments. Just how you feel right now, sitting here." Clara hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally, she whispered, "Tired." "That's fair," Dr. Morgan said, jotting it down. "Tired is a truth worth honoring." I wanted to fill the silence, to explain the nights she spent crying in the bathroom, the mornings she couldn't lift herself from bed, the way her laughter had withered in that house. But I bit my tongue. This was not my testimony. This was hers. When the session ended, Dr. Morgan smiled warmly. "One step at a time. Next week, we'll try again." Clara nodded, a faint blush in her cheeks, as if ashamed she hadn't done more. I leaned toward her and whispered, "You did enough." The following days passed with small rituals. I brewed tea every morning. Clara sat by the window with a blanket, watching the snow melt into gray slush along the curb. She didn't say much, but she stayed in the room with me, which was more than she had done before. At night, she sometimes dreamed and woke gasping, but she let me hold her until her breath slowed. That was progress, too. One afternoon, Tyler stopped by. He carried a brown paper bag and set it on the table awkwardly. "Just some things," he said. Inside was a jar of honey, a small bunch of flowers still wrapped in plastic, and a tin of cocoa mix. Clara blinked at the gifts, touched them gently as though they might break. "Thank you," she said, her voice small, but steadier than before. Tyler shrugged. "You don't owe me thanks. Just thought you could use something sweet." His ears reddened, and he shifted on his feet. I smiled, grateful for his simple kindness. That night, Clara asked if she could try making dinner. I blinked, surprised. "If you feel up to it." She pulled her hair back and moved into the kitchen. Her hands trembled when she chopped onions, but she pressed on. The scent of sautéing vegetables filled the apartment, and I realized it was the first time in months the kitchen smelled alive. She hummed under her breath, faint but unmistakable. I watched from the doorway, fighting the sting in my eyes. She had been so long silenced by cruelty that even the clatter of a spoon in her hand felt like rebellion. When she set bowls on the table, simple soup, bread warmed in the oven, she smiled, tentative but real. We ate slowly. Tyler lifted his spoon, nodded, and said, "This is good, Clara. Really good." Her cheeks flushed with shy pride. For the first time since that Christmas night, I saw her lift her head without fear. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she had begun to believe she could be. Later, as I washed the dishes, Clara stood beside me drying. "Mom," she said softly, "do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" I set down the plate and looked at her. Normal is just another word for someone else's comfort. What you will feel is whole, and that's better. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. The warm water ran over my hands, the sink filled with suds, and outside the city went about its business, unaware of the quiet miracle taking place in our small kitchen. I thought back to the threat letter, to the gavel that denied her justice, to Marcus's sneer. All of that still existed. But here, in this moment, was proof of something stronger. Resilience in the shape of a soup bowl, courage in the hum of a tune, healing in the willingness to cook again. As I turned off the tap, I felt certain for the first time that the Whitlock's cruelty would not be Clara's final chapter. She was writing new pages now, with her own hands, and I would be there to read every line with her. I have replayed that doorway 100 times in my mind, not like a movie, but like a bell you return to for the note that steadies you. The night air pressed at my back, the heat of their fire rolled over my face, and everything in me understood that lines are not drawn with ink first. They are drawn with feet. I stepped over their threshold with Clara in my arms and felt something old in me sit up and refuse to lie down again. The table glittered. The flames spoke their comfortable language, and still the room had no warmth I would recognize as human. I remember how quiet my body became before my mouth found the words. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I said what needed saying and nothing more. Tonight, she comes with me. The sentence felt carved before it was spoken, as if I had been writing it with every mile I drove toward that house, with every call I had answered and every call I had missed, with every receipt laid on my kitchen table. It was not a threat. It was not a negotiation. It was a door turning on its hinges. When I think of that moment now, I hear the crackle in their fireplace as punctuation, a place where my voice claimed its own heat. In the days that followed, the words stopped belonging only to me. They appeared in comment threads and headlines, clipped to the beginning of strangers' sentences. People wrote them on cardboard signs outside the courthouse. A woman at the grocery store touched my sleeve and whispered them with a smile that trembled. A pastor folded them into a Sunday homily about care that costs something. Someone typed them beneath a photograph of a battered pair of slippers drying on a radiator, and the image traveled farther than I could have imagined. The phrase was short enough to remember and firm enough to stand on. It did not invite argument, it invited action. Clara had mixed feelings about hearing her life summed up by a line. I understood. We sat together on the sofa while a news segment played the clip again, and I felt her go quiet the way a person does when a room suddenly turns toward them. "It's strange," she said. "It's mine, and it isn't." I tucked the blanket around her knees. "It's ours in the way a door belongs to the person who opens it," I said. "But a door is also a public thing. Other people need it too." I started calling it, in my head, the fireplace sentence. They had tried to make the fire a boundary. The words turned it into a witness. Tyler came by one evening with takeout boxes and that careful look he wears when he doesn't want to take up space. We ate at the small table and watched snow thread the street light into a thin veil. He set his fork down. "When you said it, I heard something click," he told me. "I had a fist full of anger and nowhere to put it that wouldn't break more than it fixed. Your sentence gave me a place to stand without swinging." I thanked him for what he had not done, and he shook his head. "You set the tone," he said. "You made the room choose words." I have been thinking about sentences ever since. A court hands down a sentence and calls it justice. A house hands down a sentence and calls it tradition. I handed down one line and called it enough. There are sentences that bind and sentences that free. For years, I lived under the kind that made me smaller so others could be comfortable. I was polite about pain. I treated silence like a virtue when it was sometimes a veil. The line I spoke that night was not a new belief. It was a public turning of a private key, the sound of a lock I no longer intended to carry. Letters started appearing in our mailbox and in my inbox from people I would never meet. A nurse wrote to say she used the line when she walked her sister out of a house where the air had gone thin. A man caring for his mother wrote that he repeated it in the mirror before telling a cousin who only showed up to take, not to give, that visiting hours had changed. A teacher taped it to her desk as a promise to herself about which students she would not give up on. The sentence gathered a small congregation of the stubborn-hearted. It surprised me, and it didn't. We are all waiting for someone to name the moment we have already chosen. I returned in memory to the Whitlock living room to test whether I had made anything up. The turkey was still golden. The glasses were still red with wine. Victor's hand still floated near his napkin like a gavel not yet dropped. Helen's smile still gleamed and did not reach her eyes. The fire still performed its play of comfort in a room committed to cold. In that staging, my sentence did not sound angry at all. It sounded like a boundary that love requires, a refusal to confuse endurance with devotion, a refusal to treat cruelty as culture. It was, I realized, the first honest blessing I'd ever spoken over my daughter in public. Clara keeps the words close without wearing them like a banner. She wrote them on a sticky note she hides in the back of a drawer. Some nights, she asks me to say them out loud before she sleeps, not because she doubts I'll keep my promise, but because ritual makes memory kinder. When Tyler texts to check in, he sometimes signs off with an abbreviated version. "Tonight, she's with you," and I answer, "She always was." The phrase has softened with use, the way a stone does in a pocket. It hasn't lost its edge. It has learned our hands. I don't have a fireplace. The closest we have is the small blue flame under a pot of soup. I stand at the stove and listen to the apartment's old bones settle, while Clara reads from a library book and Tyler knocks before entering with fresh bread. In the quiet, that sentence moves again through the rooms between us, not as a rallying cry, not as a judgment, but as a measure. Is this choice protective, dignifying, real? If yes, it carries the weight of the line I spoke. If no, the line turns us gently until it is. One day when the snow is gone, we will pass the house where the fireplace performed and not stop. Maybe another family will live there and build a different kind of warmth. Maybe it will stand empty for a season and learn the sound of its own silence. That is none of my business now. My business is the house I am building with my daughter, brick by plain brick, and the sentence that keeps our threshold honest. Tonight, she comes with me was never about possession. It was about presence. It was about saying, here is the direction of my feet and the promise of my care. And it is about saying, for anyone who needs the words, take them, use them, open your door. The first article landed like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples widened fast. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table when Clara's phone lit up with an alert. She read the headline aloud in a stunned whisper. Former Judge Whitlock under investigation for abuse of authority. I took the phone from her hand and scanned the lines. A team of reporters had uncovered a trail of suspicious rulings spanning Victor's career. Cases dismissed without explanation, verdicts tilted in favor of families who could afford favors. The piece cited anonymous clerks, old transcripts, even whispers from retired lawyers who had long held their tongues. Tyler had been right. Truth always finds a way. By midday, 3 more outlets had picked up the story. Evening broadcasts replayed the Christmas Eve footage alongside testimonies of Victor's courtroom patterns. They spoke of a man who carried himself like justice incarnate, but dealt judgment like currency. The same man who had sat across from me with that measured calm was suddenly the subject of calls for accountability. He could silence one judge, perhaps, but not an entire country watching with sharpened eyes. Marcus tried to stand tall in the chaos, but his arrogance cracked. His law firm issued a statement that sounded like an obituary. Effective immediately, Marcus Whitlock is suspended pending internal review. By nightfall, another message followed, blunt and final. Employment terminated. Screens filled with his photo, his smirk captured as if frozen in the moment before collapse. Colleagues he had once lorded over issued quick denials. We had no knowledge of his conduct. But the truth was simple. A man who thought himself untouchable had become toxic overnight. Helen attempted her usual choreography of grace, appearing in pearls on a morning show, trying to frame the family as misunderstood, victims of a social media frenzy. The interviewer pressed, her smile polite, but her tone edged. "Mrs. Whitlock, how do you respond to the video of your daughter-in-law left outside in freezing temperatures while you dined inside?" Helen's composure faltered for the first time. Her denial sounded brittle. By the next day, a clip of her stammering circled online under the caption, "Pearls don't warm a cold heart." Olivia fared no better. She tried to defend Marcus with a flurry of posts, mocking Clara and even me. But the internet, for once, did not reward cruelty. Each insult she hurled came back magnified. Screenshots piled against her until her accounts went private. She had spent years laughing at the expense of others. Now she was the punchline, and there was no audience left to clap. I sat with Clara each evening as the coverage grew. She was cautious with hope, her body still braced for disappointment, but I could see relief flickering like a candle inside her. "Do you think it will last?" she asked me one night. "Justice by law can be bought," I told her. "But justice by people, that's earned, and they've earned this anger." She nodded, her eyes reflecting both fear and something brighter. "It feels strange," she admitted. "I used to think no one cared." "They didn't know," I said. "Now they do. And once people see, they can't unsee." The next morning, I walked past the newsstand. Victor's face glared from every cover. Suspended. Investigation launched. Legacy under fire. For decades, he had written the sentences that decided other lives. Now his own was being written by hands he could not control. I stopped, stared at the black print, and felt no gloating, only the quiet relief of balance tipping, however late. Meanwhile, Marcus's name disappeared from the firm's brass plaque. Colleagues who once toasted him now erased him from their websites. One paper quoted an anonymous partner. "He brought disgrace to the firm. Clients no longer trust us." That was the real verdict, not one handed down by a judge, but by the weight of reputation collapsing under its own rot. For years, the Whitlocks had sat by their fireplace, basking in the glow of influence, believing the world outside was theirs to shape. Now the ashes were visible to everyone. The fire was out, and what remained was smoke clinging to their clothes. Clara scrolled through comments that night, her face half lit by the screen. Thousands of strangers defended her, called her brave, promised her that what she endured mattered. "It doesn't change the past," she murmured, "but it makes me feel less invisible." I kissed the top of her head. That's what justice is sometimes, not erasing pain, but making sure no one looks away. The verdict of the court had broken her spirit. But the verdict of the community rebuilt it piece by piece. They had stripped the Whitlocks of the one thing money could not buy back: honor. Spring announced itself quietly, snowmelt ticking from the eaves, a blue jay rehearsing on the wire, light lingering on our wall a few minutes longer. I cracked the windows for air that smelled of damp earth and the laundromat downstairs. Clara took the chair by the window with a library book and a throw blanket. Some days she read, some days she watched the clouds and turned one page an hour. Either way, the room learned her breathing and kept time to it, as if our apartment had decided to heal with her. Each morning I walked to the bakery and came back with a warm bag. We split whatever it offered and let butter find the cracks. She stopped apologizing for hunger. I stopped apologizing for hovering. In the kitchen, I showed her the patience of a pour-over: bloom, spiral, wait. We measured our quiet by the kettle. For once, silence was not a weapon. It was a room we chose. On Saturdays we cleaned, not because mess threatened us, but because touching the edges of our life reminded us those edges belonged to us. I wiped the frames that held old photos: Clara in a red scarf, me in a coach's windbreaker, with a whistle I never remembered taking off. She pressed her thumb to the glass. "You taught me to tie my skates that day." I remembered the scrape of blades on pond ice, her mittened hand finding mine, the way winter used to be a game instead of a sentence. Tyler visited with modest gifts: clementines, a paperback mystery with a cracked spine, a basil plant that leaned towards sun and smelled like July when we bruised a leaf. He never stayed long and never asked for more than she could give. Sometimes they stood on the stoop and named cloud shapes. Once, in a soft rain, he held the umbrella between them and said the precinct's coffee could strip paint. She laughed before she could stop herself. The sound startled us in the best way and lingered after the door closed. Dr. Morgan saw her weekly. I waited in the lobby, leafing through old magazines without tracking their words, no longer braced for a cry through the door. After sessions, Clara's cheeks were pink in a way that didn't mean tears. She set small goals she chose herself: take the longer block, mail the letter, write 3 kind sentences before bed. She taped the list to the fridge with a star magnet and crossed off lines with the steadiness of someone stitching a seam back together. One Sunday, I found her in the kitchen with an old recipe card in my looping script: apple pie, flour dusted the counter, apples shone under cinnamon and lemon. "Should I try?" she asked. "If you want," I said, and leaned against the door frame. We worked in our old rhythm. She cut butter into flour. I rolled the crust. She poured the fruit. I crimped the edge. When the pie came out, the apartment filled with a smell older than pain. We burned our tongues a little and did not mind. The city kept arguing, articles, hearings, statements polished to sound like contrition. Inside, we practiced steadiness. I bought a second-hand rug with a ripple pattern. Clara said it made the room feel less afraid. I hung a small wind chime from the window latch, and when a breeze wandered in, the notes admitted that air moves even when we cannot see it. On brave afternoons, she walked alone to the corner and came back with tulips too long for our only vase. We trimmed stems and used a jar. I started teaching a free Saturday class again at the community center. The first morning I tied my shoes, Clara wrapped her scarf and walked me to the bus stop. "I'll be here when you get back," she said. It sounded ordinary and felt like a blessing. When I returned, she had folded laundry and left a note on the table: "Soup on the stove. Rest first." I pressed the paper to my chest before I ate, surprised how quickly a life can relearn tenderness. There were hard nights still. Healing travels by its own map. A dream would find her, or a headline would bruise the hours. On those nights we sat on the floor with our backs to the couch and named the room to steady our breaths: lamp, book, rug, basil, window, each other. Sometimes I told stories from when she was small, how she loved the cardboard tube after the wrapping paper was gone, how she called garden worms little dragons, and asked me to move them to shade. She laughed, then wiped her eyes and slept. One evening, Tyler arrived early and asked if we could take a short drive. The air held the first true promise of spring. He parked by the river where the water ran high with melt. We watched geese quarrel their way downstream. "I don't know what you need from me," he said, "but if I can be part of it, I will." Clara reached for his hand without looking at me. Their fingers fit with the ease of a decision already found. No declarations, no deadlines, only room. On the way home, we passed a shoe store with a hand-painted sign, "Winter Clearance." Clara hesitated, then tugged my sleeve. Inside, she tried on soft leather flats the color of strong tea. When she stood and walked a small circle, I remembered the soaked slippers that had fallen into the snow and how heavy they felt in my pocket that night. The clerk wrapped the shoes in tissue that whispered. At home, she set the old slippers by the door and slid into the new ones like stepping onto her own floor. The smile arrived slowly, not wide, but deep, the kind that begins in the eyes and finally teaches the mouth what to do. It was the first true one since everything broke. I didn't say so. I opened my arms, and she stepped into them, taller again, as if a tight thread had loosened and let her breathe all the way down. We ate at the table with the window open, while a neighbor practiced piano. The melody climbed, faltered, climbed again. Clara rested her head on my shoulder. "Mom," she said, "I feel like myself." I used to think justice lived in courthouses, tall, echoing, translated into phrases by people who liked the sound of their own shoes. Now I know better. Justice is the hand on your back when you're unsteady, the meal waiting on the stove, the sentence you speak that turns a wall into a door. It is an address where a daughter can sleep without apology and wake to light she trusts. It is choosing, again and again, to stay. If anyone asks where justice is, I will point to our small table and to my daughter's unguarded smile, and I will say, it lives here, in the protection and love I will not stop giving her.